Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are going to get started here in just a couple of minutes. We're waiting for a few more attendees to join. So thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ariel Jones, and I will be emceeing today's event. So just a few things about the platform we're using. There is a chat box and a questions box. So feel free to answer or to enter any of your questions in that box. So you can enter questions throughout the entire duration of the presentation. Even if your questions aren't directly related to whatever the topic at hand is, please feel free to enter them. And we will try to respond to as many of them as we can. Another thing, we have handouts. So if you look at the handouts, there's a panel there you can click on, and we have 4 handouts. So those include our agenda for today, and a few fact sheets regarding some of the things we'll be talking about today. So feel free to take a look at those. Once the webinar is concluded, we will send out a follow-up email that includes a survey. So we really would like to have all of you guys' input in that survey. So please fill that out. You'll receive an email once the webinar is concluded. So I will hand it off now to Hagu.
Great, thanks, Ariel. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking time to join us today. My name is Hagu Salman-Carey. I'm the Senior Planner in the Code Studies Division, which is the group within the Department of City Planning that's hosting today's webinar. And today is kind of unusual and unique for us, and it's an opportunity for us to connect with business groups and affiliations to provide an entry point to you all into the department where you may not have had some. And to really connect with those of you that don't typically engage in the policy creation side of our department. Maybe some of you are familiar with our department on a project or entitlement side, but this group is unique, and I'll get more into what we do in the Code Studies Division in a second. But I just wanted to thank you for taking your lunch hour. I think we have you for about an hour and a half, and we have a lot to get through. So I'll start by going over the agenda on the next slide. So we will start by doing 2 quick introductory polls to get a sense of who's in the room, the virtual room. I'm sure there's a wide variety and a broad, we cast a broad net to get you guys here in the room today. So the poll will help us, really learn about who you are, what industry you represent, and your familiarity with the department in this kind of policy making aspect. We'll do a brief overview of what I like to think of as our small but mighty division, and overview 3 policy initiatives that we're currently working on to serve really as an example for you all of the issues that we are working on now, and some of the twists and turns of the legislative process, in hopes that these example policy initiatives are relevant to you and the work that you do, either in the private sector or the nonprofit sector. And then we'll leave the remaining time for questions and answer, and just a quick set of closing remarks. So I'm going to start by launching the first poll. Ariel, if you could help us out by launching that. This question really is asking, what industry you're representing. And we have these 5 categories: entitlement, land use, hospitality, service industry, including restaurant, food and beverage, construction, real estate, architectural engineering, chamber and other trade groups. So take a moment now to please select the closest industry that you represent or you're here representing. And also, if you don't see your industry represented, please go ahead and use the chat function and let us know, what you are affiliated with, so that we can know who's in the room. So I'll give you just another minute or so. I wish we had some music, but we don't. But all right, let's close the poll and see what we have. Okay. So by and large, entitlement and land use at 63%, 13% hospitality, 13% construction real estate, no one from architecture and engineering, and chamber and other trade groups, 13%. Okay. Yeah, I imagine there would be a wide range. I think this skews a little more to the land use and entitlements, and I'm happy that all of you have made it, so appreciate that. And then let me just check the chat to see if anyone chatted anything different. Don't see anything. Okay. All right, well, with that, let's launch the next poll, which is super brief. It's just asking, how familiar are you with the department's planning policy initiatives and adoption process. So this is kind of more the wheelhouse of the Code Studies and Policy, Citywide Policy Bureau that we work in. Let's see, I'm watching things come in here. So we have not familiar, somewhat familiar, familiar, and very familiar. And I see that half of you have voted, so we'll give it 20 more seconds. Don't be shy. 59%. Okay. All right. Well, give it a little more time. I see more people are voting. Okay. Closing in on a minute here. Okay, let's close the poll and see where we landed. Okay, great. So 8% not familiar, 58% somewhat familiar, 25% familiar, and 8% very familiar. Okay, so I think we have a pretty large majority of the group in the middle of the bell curve there. So I hope this will be useful to you. You know, given these responses, we've kept kind of our portion of the presentation of our 3 example initiatives pretty high level, just to bring everyone up to speed and to leave more time for questions and detailed questions at that. So, you know, please do feel free to, as Ariel said, enter your questions in the chat as we go along, and then we'll kind of at one time go through those. And the project managers that are going to be presenting on the various initiatives will be happy to respond. Lastly, I just kind of also wanted to note that the policy items that we present on, you know, are all at different phases in the legislative process. And so it's a good way for us to share about the various steps in the legislative process that can, you know, change the trajectory of a policy item. So on to the next slide. Just wanted to give a quick introduction of who Code Studies is. We're within the citywide bureau of the department, and we work on policy issues related to the city as a whole, but are typically very focused on a specific topic. There are 9 of us, which is why I call us small but mighty. And there are mugshots for you to see and hopefully connect our voices. You know, in general, we respond to city council's new policy ideas as they come up, and those are introduced, you know, in council through motions. Sometimes we initiate motions internally ourselves. We are essentially in charge of maintaining the city's zoning code, which is housed in the Los Angeles Municipal Code, Chapter 1, soon to be a Chapter 1A as well, which we'll talk a little bit about in a second. And, you know, these are where we house all the rules for how to do development and policy within the city. We engage in research on topics that we're, you know, charged with either modifying or advancing. We not only do code amendments, but we do a lot of report backs. So if members of the council have specific ideas they want to explore before they're sure on what change to the rules should occur, we engage in that kind of research too and do some report writing, which you often find in the council file relative to the motion. And then importantly, we conduct outreach to stakeholders on relevant topics that are before us. And, you know, I think one of our main goals as a unit, as a division, I should say, is to really engage more broader and reach wider audience of stakeholders that have not traditionally been engaged with. And, you know, I think that along with kind of explaining and engaging and engendering stakeholders, variety of stakeholders, the variety of backgrounds into the legislative process is one of our main charges. You know, and our role is to really balance the various stakeholder perspectives that we hear. I don't think I've ever been part of any code amendment or report back where there was just one kind of unilateral or opinion. So it's always very varied given the size of our city and the various interests and perspectives. And so our goal and our job is really to propose implementable standards for decision makers to consider, modify, or approve that really reflect the wide variety of feedback that we get. So today we hope to highlight a few ways in which, you know, our work can impact you and your business or business affiliated groups. So just quickly onto the next slide, I wanted to share, just so you get a sense of how we're structured. This image is a quick glimpse into our organizational chart at the executive level to kind of orient you. We are a very large department, and this kind of shows you our overall structure. So most of you may know, our director is Vince Bertoni, and then we have 4 bureaus that cover citywide policy, which is where our group is situated, community planning. These include our 35 community plans that really make up the state mandated land use element that every city has. And that's led by Shauna Bonston. And then our project planning bureau, which is also in other cities known as current planning. These are like real-time development projects. That's headed up by Lisa Weber. And then operations and engagement, the deputy director for which is, the position is currently vacant, but that includes kind of our external affairs, functions, as well as other in-house administration. So that gives you a big picture of how we're organized. And just zooming in on the citywide policy, the next slide will show you our deputy director, Arthi Varma, who oversees all the citywide efforts, and that obviously includes code studies, as I mentioned. In addition to that, it's general citywide policy that could include everything from our, our general plan and other elements, specifically our housing policy, which housing element, as major of an issue as that is for our city, kind of has its own team, our historic resources, and our urban design functions. So I just wanted to provide that context as we move into the policy initiatives we aim to share with you today. And I think I will now hand it over to our project manager for the Processes and Procedures Ordinance, Bonnie Kim. Bonnie?
Great, thank you for that introduction, Hagu. And as she had mentioned, my name is Bonnie Kim, and I'm the project manager for this particular policy initiative, the Processes and Procedures Ordinance. So I'll just quickly go through an overview of what's contained in the ordinance and next steps in the adoption process. Next slide, please. So to give you a bit of background, this ordinance has actually been in the works for several years. This is one component of a larger program to comprehensively update the city zoning code, which was last updated in a comprehensive manner in 1946. So it's long overdue. And the overall intent behind this Process and Procedures Ordinance is essentially to make the rules for a project review and policy adoption more clear and easy to understand, so that the zoning code is accessible to stakeholders with varying levels of familiarity with the current zoning code. And this is all to allow such stakeholders, such as the businesses and individuals, to engage in this policy creation and adoption process, as well as better engage in the project planning process as well. Next slide, please. So the way that we intend to essentially make these zoning code process procedures easier to understand and more accessible to stakeholders is by using these 3 concepts of standardization, consolidation, and centralization. With standardization, in an attempt to reduce inconsistency between the various process procedures, we've established a standard format for all processes, and particularly focused on standardizing the timelines for a notice of public hearing, time to act, and appeal periods, all of which help contribute to a more predictable project planning and policy adoption process. Then we've also used the concept of consolidation to reduce unnecessary variation between processes. So we identified processes that were similar but had slight variation and consolidated the approximately 120 current zoning code processes down to about 60 instead. So essentially reducing by half. And then lastly, we centralize the location of all of these process procedures into a unified place, Article 13, Chapter 1A of the Los Angeles Municipal Code. Currently, the process procedures are sort of scattered throughout Chapter 1. So they're hard to find unless you already know where they are. And so we've taken all of that and put them into one centralized location. Next slide, please. So as I had mentioned, this ordinance has been in the works for several years. It actually started back in 2016, and we've issued several drafts. One draft which was actually considered by the City Planning Commission back in 2018. But at the time, we continued to receive feedback from the community as well as our own colleagues. So we took the opportunity to sort of consider all of that and incorporate some revisions, and eventually came out with a revised draft late last year in 2020, and opened a public comment period again, and have incorporated several more revisions in response to the community feedback. So we are now finally in the stage to take this revised draft back to the City Planning Commission, and we're actually scheduled to be heard at the City Planning Commission next Thursday, March 25th. And then once the City Planning Commission has taken their action, it would eventually be taken to the City Council for their consideration and vote as well. Next slide, please. So again, this is just an overview introduction to the ordinance, but we do have time set aside for questions. So if you have more detailed questions you would like to ask, please feel free to enter that into the chat or questions box. But in a nutshell, the key provisions that this ordinance is proposing are standardized notification timelines, updated appeal rights, some more flexibility in development rights, some new processes as well as modifications to existing processes, and then several changes in process name as well as some changes in the decision maker on certain entitlements. Next slide. So again, just high level, in general, the feedback that we have received on the ordinance, we've generally heard support for this idea of streamlined processes and more accessibility, but we've also heard on the flip side that you know, communities would like us to consider increased notification requirements, potentially increased time or mailing radius, as well as a request to make sure that our ordinance is not introducing any unintended changes to the process and procedures. Next slide, please. I believe this is the last. So as I had mentioned earlier, we are currently scheduled to be heard at the City Planning Commission next Thursday, March 25th. After their action, the ordinance would be considered by the Planning and Land Use Management Committee of the City Council, then form a legality by our City Attorney, and then finally return to the full body of the City Council for their official adoption vote.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. Again, don't forget to chat questions related to processes and procedures so we can keep track of those and you don't forget. And with that, I will turn it over to Roberto Luna for the restaurant beverage program.
Thanks, Hagu. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roberto Luna, and I will be giving an overview of the Restaurant Beverage Program, or RBP. The RBP is an ordinance we've been working on that is intended to make it easier for certain sit-down restaurants to serve alcohol. So, next slide. The RBP aims to create a new simplified process to allow sit-down restaurants to serve alcohol for on-site consumption instead of having to apply for a conditional use permit if they meet specific eligibility criteria and follow a set of operating standards. As you may know, obtaining a CUP can take upwards of 6 months and cost about $13,000. As initially proposed, we estimated that an approval under the proposed RBP would cost about $2,000 and take roughly 4 weeks. The ordinance limits eligibility to sit-down restaurants only. This means that bars, nightclubs, liquor stores will not be eligible. The RBP was approved by the City Planning Commission last June and by the City Council's Planning and Land Use Management Committee in November. The Plum Committee also introduced significant changes to the ordinance to address concerns from communities that have been historically negatively impacted by the overconcentration of alcohol selling establishments. Next slide. So there are currently 2 application processes for the RBP that are currently under consideration. The first is the administrative process, or the process that coast cities presented to CPC and the Plum Committee. In this process, a restaurant would come to our public counter to file an application. Staff would verify it meets the eligibility criteria, and then the restaurant would pay the fees. And then from then on, the restaurant would then be approved to serve alcohol under the RBP. The provisional process was introduced by the Plum Committee, and we are currently looking into how this process could be implemented. The main idea is that a restaurant would receive provisional approval and be required to come back for a one-year review. During this review, a decision maker would evaluate whether the restaurant has been compliant with the RBP's provisions during that year. If the restaurant passes this review, it would receive a permanent approval to continue selling alcohol under the RBP. Next slide. Yeah. Here's a more complete overview of the RBP's development timeline. We released the initial draft of the ordinance in October 2018. We conducted 2 staff-level public hearings to gather input in December 2018 and January 2019. Following those hearings, we accepted additional input and we had targeted conversations with various community stakeholders. We incorporated feedback into a revised draft of the ordinance that we released in April 2020. The CPC approved the RBP in June 2020, and the Plum Committee approved it in November 2020. Now the RBP and Plum's proposed changes need to be considered by the City Council's Economic Development and Jobs Committee. And this meeting has not yet been scheduled. Next slide. Here is a breakdown of the RBP's key provisions. Do note that since the RBP is still in the legislative approval process, these are subject to change. The RBP is intended for sit-down restaurants only. Bars, nightclubs, liquor stores, retailers, and other business types would not be eligible. To be eligible, restaurants must have a kitchen operating at all times to deliver all food and beverages to tables and close by 11, among other criteria. Restaurants would be required to follow good neighbor standards, which would require them to limit noise, monitor customer and employee behavior, and maintain the premises in good condition. Activities such as dancing, DJs, karaoke, live entertainment would be prohibited. Security measures include installing and maintaining a camera surveillance system. Restaurants would also be required to post a city-issued decal stating they are participating in the RBP to assist with enforcement. Restaurants must respond to complaints from community members and customers in a timely manner. We are also exploring the logistics of establishing a community complaint portal as requested by the Plum Committee. Administrative standards would require that the city notify neighborhood councils and council district offices of new RBP applicants within their boundaries. And lastly, the ordinance contains enforcement procedures to remove non-compliant restaurants from the program. If a restaurant violates the RBP standards 3 times within 2 years, it will be suspended from the RBP for 5 years. Restaurants must also enroll in the Monitoring, Verification, and Inspection Program, or MVIP. This is a proactive inspection program that conducts unannounced inspections to verify compliance. Throughout its development, we have received feedback from diverse stakeholders throughout the city that has helped shape the ordinance. Those in support of the RBP have stated that it would remove the uncertainty and high stop costs associated with a CUP. A more predictable process could also help them recover from the financial impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also heard concerns about the overconcentration of alcohol selling businesses and communities that have been historically impacted by the sale and consumption of alcohol, namely those that are low income and communities of color. Concerns were also shared about restaurants that may operate as bars or nightclubs. To address this, the RBP includes narrow standards to filter out these restaurants. Additionally, the RBP's community monitoring standards were included to address concerns about a lack of a public hearing, since the RBP would be an administrative process. And as previously mentioned, the Plum Committee introduced additional protections to address these concerns. Next slide. Okay. And the next step for the RBP is to be considered by the City Council's Economic Development and Jobs Committee. This meeting has not yet been scheduled. After it is approved by this committee, it will be sent to the City Attorney's Office for formal legality, and then to the full City Council for final approval. If you would like to stay informed about the RBP and be added to our interested parties list, feel free to email me, Roberto Luna. My email will be provided at the end of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. That was great. Our last ordinance that we want to highlight for feedback is going to be presented by Andrew Pennington on the local emergency ordinance. Andrew?
Thanks for the introduction, Hagu. Good afternoon, Andrew Pennington. I'm here to present on the proposed local emergency ordinance. Next slide, please. The local emergency ordinance was drafted in response to a motion adopted by City Council. The motion directed the department to craft legislation that would provide specific types of regulatory relief as a way to address the economic impacts of the current COVID-19 pandemic. The two areas targeted for relief are time limits and expirations for conditional use permits and automobile parking requirements. The proposed ordinance provides the relief sought by creating a new mechanism in the zoning code for these types of economic relief measures. It supplements many of the existing life safety temporary regulations that are already available during a local emergency that exists in the code currently. Next slide, please. The initial relief provided includes an extension of the time limits and expirations of most conditional use permits and related actions. It also suspends certain off-site and valet parking requirements and limits additional parking requirements for changes of use. The proposed ordinance is only applicable during a local emergency and its recovery. The provisions must also be activated by the City Council or the Mayor, and they would sunset 1 year after the end of the local emergency they were activated during. This time period can be extended up to 3 years after the end of the local emergency by resolution by City Council. After its initial review of the proposed ordinance by the City Council's Planning and Land Use Management Committee, amendments were adopted to expand eligibility for the suspension of off-site parking, as well as further parking relief related to the expansion of outdoor dining. Next slide, please. The proposed ordinance is on an accelerated timeline due to the timeliness of the issue at hand. The motion instructing the department to commence work on the ordinance was introduced in March of 2020 and adopted by the full City Council in May of that year. The initial draft of the ordinance was released this past October with a public hearing in November and consideration by the City Planning Commission in December. It was considered by the Council's Planning and Land Use Management Committee just a few weeks ago on February 16th. Next slide, please. The ordinance proposes to extend time limits and expiration dates for conditional use permits and other quasi-judicial actions. Additionally, it extends the utilization periods for both of these types of entitlements. These time extensions are applicable to most of the concurrent entitlements when an applicant is pursuing multiple permit approvals for one project. However, projects that have potential for intense environmental impacts are ineligible, as are projects subject to a revocation proceeding that has resulted in corrective action. An application and a review of the original approval and environmental documentation will be required. The ability to extend term limits, expirations, or utilization period will sunset once the duration of the ordinance ends, and any new expiration or time limit will be final. Next slide, please. The ordinance proposes to grant modifications to existing parking requirements for businesses that meet certain eligibility criteria. The three scenarios eligible for some type of parking relief are applications for a change of use within an existing building, conditions of approval requiring valet parking and/or requiring off-site parking, as well as expansions of outdoor dining space. The eligibility criteria for each varies, with the most exacting criteria for the relief for changes of use. For applications for changes of use, parking relief, only non-residential uses are eligible, and the existing building footprint must be maintained. Only the first 5,000 square feet of floor floor area are eligible for this parking relief. This relief is provided citywide and supersedes any specific plan or overlay requirements as well. This parking modification for eligible businesses is applicable for the life of the use. This means a business or property will not be required to provide additional parking after the expiration of these provisions. Valet and off-site parking relief are available for most legislative and discretionary actions. The suspension of the condition is temporary, and the enforcement of those conditions and any associated covenants will commence at the sunset of these provisions. The waiver of additional parking for any outdoor dining expansion was added by the Plum Committee in February. The exact language is still being finalized. Next slide, please. At the virtual staff hearing in November, over 24 members of the public were in attendance, with most speaking in favor of the proposal. Many of the comments and concerns reinforced the need for the ordinance. Minor concerns were expressed related to how it could affect specific plans, as well as its applicability in the coastal zone. Overall, the sentiment was positive, though a number of speakers advocated for further relief from parking provisions, as well as other limitations for impacted businesses such as restaurants and similar congregate venues. Next slide, please. As previously mentioned, the proposed ordinance went before the Plum Committee on February 16th. The committee endorsed the proposal, however, directed the department to amend the proposal to expand the parking relief provisions to broaden both eligibility and to further provide relief for outdoor dining expansions. As part of the amendment process, the ordinance will undergo a form and legality review by the city attorney before returning to committee and then the full city council for consideration and potential adoption. A resolution is required to enable the provisions during the current local emergency and will be required if the ordinance is adopted. A draft resolution to do just this was requested during Plum's consideration. If adopted, the department is looking into crafting a public awareness campaign and is already taking steps to educate staff and create processes for its implementation. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions.
Great, thank you, Andrew. That kind of concludes our brief high-level overview of these three initiatives that we hope speak to some of you in the audience. I did want to just take a moment to honor the two folks on the call or on the webinar who posted their affiliation in the questions function. We have a member of the webinar from a CDFI and a member from Neighborhood Council. So thank you for sharing that. And I guess with that, I'd like to go ahead and ask folks to enter any questions they have in the question tab, and I will hand it over to Ariel to help MC us. And certainly those of us on the call, project managers, feel free to chime in when a topic related to your question comes up. And I'll just add, if our work, as you know, the department does a lot, and if you have questions that aren't related to the three policy initiatives listed here, still feel free to ask them, and we will take those in, take notes, and try to link you up with the right person within the department that can either get you an answer or get you, you know, some time to discuss your thoughts on the topic. So I see a few questions coming in. I'll hand it over to Ariel to help us MC.
Great, thank you, Hagu. So I see a question from Margaret Taylor. Margaret, if you're on the line, I can unmute you and you can ask your question verbally. So I'm gonna unmute you. You should be unmuted now, Margaret.
Hi, thank you very much. And thank you to all of the staff and all of the hard work to try to make the city more transparent, clear, and business friendly. I think a lot of us on the line, especially those of us who do entitlements, are very concerned about COVID-19, how that's really changed the landscape and the economic recovery. I'm not sure how much the planning department is aware that the commercial landlords have had a moratorium on evictions, and majority have not been collecting any rent for a year, which means the small businesses that are currently open and operating or reopening have not been paying rent. And there is a real probability of a lot of vacancies and new tenants having to take those vacancies. And so these ordinances are coming, but they're not implemented yet. And there's a lot of delay in being able to get the relief needed to really, at a critical time, help the city recover. So some questions that I have are just planning administrative. For example, this planning department's very still reliant on physical file deliveries between planners in order to keep projects moving forward or get clearances. Is there any plan to allow these things to be done electronically instead of all of the delays of physical handling of files? Second is there any willingness to allow wet signatures on planning applications instead of notaries under COVID-19 and back east weather? To have that requirement seems outdated when other departments are accepting electronic notarized signatures. And is there any consideration for small business priority processing? Because they really, there's a lot of, the restaurant beverage program has not been implemented yet. A lot of business models are changing and are inconsistent with C4 zoning or R5 zoning. A lot of these neighborhood commercial properties are going to need variances for parking relief or use variances until these adoptions come into place. They're not there yet. And there really needs to be, for example, for variances, a faster way of getting a determination if there's a waived hearing and a quicker path for publication. So is the planning department within your control able to do any small business priority processing? And also just a concern also that the restaurant beverage program is not implemented and CUB cases are no longer going through the expedite unit. They're back with the GEO teams. And that actually is, a slow process right now. So there's a concern, again, that things are actually under COVID-19. There has not been relief except through LA al fresco for small businesses in the planning department. And is there, and a final just reminder, the LA County Recorder's Office is closed. So as we've been e-certified as, to record with the county, but a lot of businesses are not. And so much in the planning department is still reliant on getting that actual recorded covenant back. So it just seems like it's been slower in planning in a lot of areas. And is there, on the administrative level, aside from these ordinances and policies that are pending, is there any plan to provide relief in a processing form without having to escalating all the time? And we don't want to have to do that, but it's putting pressure on these applicants to be able to recover. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for that question. Many questions, actually, and I think some really are just good suggestions about mainly, I heard prioritizing small businesses in the administrative process. I don't know that any of us on, in the Code Studies Division really have a solid handle on what work is being contemplated or, being addressed to answer some of those more administrative aspects. I do know work is being done, and I can certainly appreciate that it's not moving fast enough. I think that, is something I think we'd all like to see different, but I'm gonna just take down these notes and hopefully maybe connect you with folks who have a better handle on what systems are being put in place. I think the feedback that we hope to share out with our other, sister bureaus, probably in terms of the, admin side and external affairs, as well as our project planning bureau, who I think is more the interface with, probably you and the folks on the call who do entitlements, will be valuable for them to hear. I think maybe folks who are representing those bureaus are on this call, so they heard you probably loud and clear, but we'll certainly circle back. And I'd just encourage you maybe to follow up on the email that Ariel will send out with some resources after this webinar, to just do a reply and include me on that. And then I'll try to get you the information, if there is any that kind of speaks to what you're saying. But certainly just want to honor the fact that this feels like a slowing of sorts, given the more in-person paper approach we've had in the past, and how it does take time for us to kind of come up to speed with some of the necessary modifications to our processes. I'm going to also just look, there's one resource I want to check for you while we go to the next question, if that's okay. I know that's not a sufficient answer, so to speak, but let me do a little bit of digging while we go on to the next question and try to get back to you. But please do respond to the email and include me. My contact is on the next slide, and we'll share that with you shortly.
Great, thank you for looking into that, Hagu. So we do have a couple more questions. I see one from Samantha Salmon, and they're asking, what work are you doing to support healthy food businesses like grocery stores, produce carts, and etc.? And then the second part of that question is, have you heard of the Good Food Zone policy? And what role can your department play in getting that implemented?
Great question. I might call on Roberto. It's not to speak about that. We're definitely aware. We're working on another ordinance that is somewhat related and has us more in partnership with our sister department, economic, EWDD, where the Good Food Zone work is coming out of. Roberto, would you like to just touch briefly on that and how we are looking into that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so as Hago mentioned, we are working on another ordinance related to alcohol. That's the deemed approved ordinance, which would concern establishments that are currently selling alcohol, but don't have a conditional use permit because they were operating prior to the conditional use requirement of the city in the 70s and 80s. And so we've been communicating with Food Policy Council, which helped initiate the Good Food Zone policy. And while we don't have direct work in the Good Food Zone policy, we do understand that there have been some, that they are working on getting it rolling, but there have been some budget concerns and some funding concerns. So but they are looking forward to getting that program rolling. And the idea is for businesses that would be affected by the deemed approval ordinance to help connect them to the Good Food Zone policy, to have them participate in that program so that they could benefit from the incentives that there are going to be brought forth by that program, and many of the benefits as well to improve the communities around them as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, our hope is to have, as Roberto said, both a carrot and a stick approach. There is this idea that some businesses who haven't had the standards that others with CUBs, given their grandfathered nature, don't have any check and balance, as most do in the city with a CUB and conditions applied through the discretionary process. So the idea would be, especially during COVID recovery, not to be too punitive, but to do our job in, connecting a majority of those that have been good actors and continue to be good actors with opportunities to improve maybe what their offerings are to the community through, policy or programs that sister agencies, sister departments have going. It's been actually a very fulfilling and rewarding work program for Roberto and I to work with the LA Food Policy Council. And there's been a few very good examples of the Healthy Neighborhood Markets program that they've been running through technical assistance work they do with liquor stores that have really transitioned and offered more healthy foods to the neighborhood and help them with everything from like supply chain and distribution issues to just even serving beyond just food, but serving as a resource center. I think one of the examples, kids could come in and do homework in a little corner while their parents shop around. So it's really been transformative for certain businesses. And so we've learned a lot from them and hope to, unlike other ordinances, kind of turn the process on its head and do a significant amount of outreach before we release a draft ordinance so that we can establish our role as not only supporting, kind of healthy transition for off-site serving alcohol establishments, but also dealing with those that the very few that may be not being good actors in the neighborhood to establish a set of standards that are in the code that hold them accountable. So hopefully that answers your question. I just wanted to get a moment to respond to the first question. I think we have someone from our External Affairs office on the call that might have something to add. I just wanted to make sure we could respond as thoroughly as possible. So Yeg, are you on the call?
Yes. Hi, Yerik, with the External Affairs Division. I heard the question about improvements that the department can and should undertake to make it easier to conduct business. It's well received. It's something that, quite frankly, management has focused very seriously this past year. Obviously, the weeks and months immediately after COVID, the priority was ensuring that we can resume business as normal or as normal as possible, meaning supporting our online commission meetings and certainly providing technology from one's home in order to review project cases and obviously advance policies. What we've really begun to do as a result of that also is create a new online payment system for all planning applications, that's entitlements as well as administrative cases. And through our online application system have also begun to digitalize our submissions, mostly for clearances. But the goal, quite frankly, in the months and year ahead is really to allow applicants to make the choice whether they want to come to one of our public counters for in-person assistance as well as consultation, or quite frankly, if they want to submit everything online. So that is certainly the direction we're going. To give one very specific example, if you're a property, or if you own a property within a historic preservation overlay district, so essentially a local historic district, we're allowing now for electronic plan stamping, and that was also done largely on the basis of recognizing that we wanted to streamline the entitlement process and reduce certain bottlenecks. And what we've seen as a result, quite frankly, is also a reduction in the amount of time it takes from filing to completion. And that's something that we're hoping to focus more on as we talk about ways to help small businesses through the economic recovery, using everything from administrative clearances, which have helped, say, the time from filing to completion to go from, when you look at the 6,000 plus applications the department considers at any given year, from months to essentially less than a month. So those are just a few of the efforts that are underway. And of course, if there's anything more specific we can answer, please do not hesitate to ask.
Great, thank you for that, Yeg. So I'm looking at our questions panel. It doesn't look like we have anything else just yet. So for our audience members, please feel free to enter your questions. You can also use the raise hand icon and we'll see that and click on your name so you can ask your question out loud. So we'll give it a few more minutes here.
Perhaps, Ariel, while folks think of their questions and type them in, we could go to the contact information slide and just keep that up for a while so participants can jot down our contact information for any follow-up or question by email. And I think while you're maybe typing in your question, or if we've perhaps don't get any more, just wanted to thank everyone for participating and taking your lunch time to be with us today. All the presenters on the call, contact information are listed here. We all have the first name dot last name at lacity.org convention, so please feel free to reach out to us with any questions. Um, I see one other question. I think we haven't gotten to this one. Will the parking relief ordinance apply to specific plan areas? Andrew, do you want to take that one?
Apologies, just took me a second to unmute. Can you repeat the question quick, Hago?
Yeah, or perhaps Ariel, do you want to unmute Margaret
yeah.
just to make sure?
Yeah, sure. Okay, Margaret, we'll unmute you again. Okay.
Hi, Andrew. Yes, I remember from the Plum Committee that there was a recommendation that the parking relief ordinance might apply to a couple of specific plan areas. We just have so much interest in potentially occupying other specific plan areas. I was just wondering what the current proposal is, if it's to apply to all specific plan areas, or will it be limited to a couple, and which ones?
It will, as written right now, and based off the feedback we got from Plum Committee, it will apply to all. It would be too difficult to kind of pick and choose which one. So at the moment, unless something changes when we go back to Plumber Council, this parking relief would apply to any specific plan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you for that question, Margaret. I'm not seeing any more questions just yet, so we'll give it a couple of minutes.
And in the meantime, I could just add that, again, we'll be sending out an email with the survey that Ariel mentioned at the top of the webinar. Hopefully you can fill that out. It really helps us to understand, who our audience is, particularly from the business community. Forward it to anyone in your, sphere of influence or, work contacts that you think could benefit from either, providing feedback to us on different topics that come before our group or in general. It's just really good for us to kind of try to reach audiences that we don't always get a chance to reach out to. And I think there'll also be some resources that are also added to that email. Ariel, is that right? Would you maybe share some of those with us?
Right, yeah. So we have a couple of resources on our website. You can actually probably see them now, but we wanted to share a couple of tools. So one of them is this case reports and mapping tool. And let me back up a little bit. So you can find it by going to planning.lacity.org. And then if you click on resources, you can go to case reports. It's right here under reports and publications. And then this page will give you a sense of some of the cases that are being processed through our department on a biweekly basis. So you can look at current case filings as well as completed cases. And we're also working on adding additional features that would allow people to better drill down to the areas that they'd like to see. So if you want to look by council district or neighborhood council boundary and etc., you can do that as well. And then here on the left side, we have a list of dates. So if you have a specific range of dates that you're looking for, you can find those here. And then again, this will be included in a follow-up email. We also have our proposed land use regulations that may be of interest to you. So that's underneath the plans and policies tab here. And then if you look under land use regulations, you can click proposed regulations, and that'll take you to some of the things that our department is working on. And if there's something specific you're looking for, you can do a word search. So if I wanted to look up processes and procedures, I'd type that in. And then I can also look at the council file. I can see who the staff contact is and other relevant information. here. So for instance, if I wanted to look at that council file number, I could just click here and it will take me to our council file management system where I can follow on to see what's happening with the proposed ordinance and etc. And then we also have our email sign up. So if you click on the About tab and go to email sign up right here under Stay Connected, you'll find this page. So you can enter your information here and click on which topics you are most interested in that are city planning related. And then hit sign up and you will receive notifications related to whatever you checked. And some of you may be familiar with our ZMIS tool. So that's our zoning information map access system, where you can type in any address in the city and it'll take you to that specific parcel, or you can just zoom in if you have a specific parcel of interest. And you can click on that parcel to see what's currently happening there, if there are any relevant cases or any planning actions that are currently happening for that specific parcel, any projects, and etc. So this is a pretty useful tool if you have questions about what's happening, you know, in your area or anywhere else in the city. Let's see, I'm trying to find a parcel that I know has a project currently happening. Let's see. Just to give an example. So you can select a parcel and then relevant information comes up. You can see the community plan area. You can look up relevant zoning information. And then case numbers. So again, this will be sent out in a follow-up email. Was there anything else that I should cover, Hagu, or anyone else on the line that might be helpful?
I think that's a great question. If folks have any burning desire to find a bit of information that you may feel has eluded you in the past, please do ask us now. We can help you navigate there. But I think that covers most of it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And just what I just did there was I clicked on a parcel and then I looked at what was happening underneath case numbers. And typically you can click on a case number and see more relevant documents that might be related to that parcel and assign staff and etc.
Thanks, Ariel. That's really helpful. I guess I don't want to keep folks. I think we've lost one or two. Let's just confirm. Are there any additional questions that came in during your demo? Don't believe so. Okay. Well, I just want to take this opportunity to thank everyone again for spending your lunch hour with us. We hope this was fruitful and useful for you. We'd love to stay connected. Please do sign up to our email service on interesting topics to you, and please do respond with the survey as it provides us some good insight into who we're serving. And with that, I just hope that you all stay safe and stay well and continue to do the good work that you're doing. Thanks, everyone.